I don't know about you, but I am far more interested in mysteries that have occurred in the relatively recent past. I think it's easier to relate to the people involved because they probably lived their lives kind of similar to how you're living now. Different, but similar, right? You know, and also like the information, if you're looking at a case that happened 50 years ago or less, it's easier to fact check that information, and there's probably more information about that case. Whereas if you're looking at something that's happened, let's say hundreds and hundreds of years ago, while certainly there are people involved and being a human being, I can relate to them in that sense, but the way they lived is a lot different than we live now. And so it's very difficult to kind of put myself in their perspective because my experience living on the earth is so much different. And of course, information, even if it was diligently transcribed at the time, it's taken hundreds of years to arrive in front of me now. And so the opportunity for information to change or to be passed down inaccurately or to just be a straight up embellishment is much higher. So the accuracy of information in older cases, it's a little bit up for grabs. So I tend to be interested in more recent mysteries. But there is one case, in fact, it is the oldest unsolved mystery in American history that I have been fascinated with ever since I heard about it in grade school. And the reason I'm talking about it now in this video is not only have I found it fascinating, but there has been some recent discoveries, as recent as 2011, that totally changed the theories about what could have happened in this particular case. And the case I'm referencing is the lost colony of Roanoke. The too long didn't read version of the story is when England first tried to colonize America, they set up a colony on Roanoke Island, which is right off the coast of North Carolina. And when it wasn't going very well and the early colonists, they needed more supplies, they sent their leader back to England to get more supplies. But when he came back, the colony was gone. All 115 people gone without a trace. And all that was left were two strange messages. One was on a tree and one was on a fence post right in where the colony used to be. And for centuries, historians and amateur sleuths alike have debated what those messages mean. But a recent discovery in 2011 completely changes people's interpretation of what happened at Roanoke. Before we get started, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, well, you've come to the right channel because that is literally all I'm going to be doing. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these cool stories. All right, let's dive in. By the late 1500s, England wanted to colonize America. And in the early 1580s, an Englishman by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh was basically given a permit to go colonize America. Basically it said, okay, it's 1580 and you have until 1591 to colonize somewhere in America. If you can't do it by then, you're going to lose your permit. He starts getting funding together. He starts, looking on a map to figure out where's a good spot to land. And by 1584, he's ready to launch his first reconnaissance mission to America. So in 1584, 2 ships make their way to North America and they land somewhere in the Outer Banks in North Carolina. They land and they actually quickly befriend the local Native Americans that are there. And in fact, they invite these English people to come to their village, which was on Roanoke Island, also in North Carolina, not too far from the Outer Banks. And so these early English settlers are brought to this village and they're able to coexist with the Native Americans really beautifully. They're sharing trade secrets, they're learning how to hunt, they're learning how to do all the things that you would need if you were going to live in this new land. And again, they're being embraced by the local population, which was huge. So after 1 month of this reconnaissance mission, that group of early settlers is really excited about the possibilities of settling in America. So they make their way back to England and they share their findings with Sir Walter Raleigh, and preparations are immediately began to launch an actual colonization effort into Roanoke. So 1 year after this initial reconnaissance mission, Sir Walter Raleigh is ready to launch this full-fledged effort to colonize America. And so he sends 7 ships with 600 men and supplies that were designed to last that group of people for a full year. And so everything's going beautifully. They're sailing their way over to America. And when they reach the Outer Banks, their flagship, the biggest and best ship they had that was carrying the bulk of their supplies, their food, their fresh water, it ran aground and a lot of their supplies fell into the ocean and were spoiled. And so this is a devastating blow, and they know immediately that, well, not everybody on this fleet can actually land here. So they sent 500 men back to England and only landed 100 of the original 600 in Roanoke. Now, as soon as this second round of settlers, these 100 men, landed in Roanoke, they went and spoke with the local Native Americans. There was already good relationships built from that first reconnaissance mission, and these settlers were given permission by the local natives to build their colony in Roanoke. So they begin constructing their colony, and everything is going off without a hitch. In fact, the Native Americans were incredibly generous. They worked closely with the settlers and, did their best to support them however they could. Now, the settlers, they still needed more supplies. They didn't have this robust supply that they planned on having because much of it was destroyed in that shipwreck as they initially made their way in. So they had been promised by the 500 returning crew members that they were going to send supplies by the following winter. So they're anticipating this shipment of new supplies, and as they get closer to the winter time, the 100 settlers that are there, they're running incredibly low on supplies to the point where they actually basically run out. And so they had to rely on the local Native Americans' generosity just to stay alive. When the shipment that was supposed to be there in the winter did not show up, and in fact had actually been canceled, they didn't know this, it had been canceled by Queen Elizabeth, who basically said that wasn't important, we're going to focus on things that are happening in England. When that doesn't show up, the tensions between these 100 settlers and the local natives, the tension was growing because now there's a huge overdependency. That tension grew to the point where the leader of the settlers and the leader of the local Native Americans began to not trust each other. And in fact, the local natives, instead of being violent, decided that they would just abandon Roanoke and go to the mainland and would just kind of give Roanoke Island to the settlers, and that would kind of solve all the problems. But the English settlers took their retreat as a sign that they were actually going to the mainland of North Carolina, these Native Americans, and were going to be forming alliances with other tribes, and then they were going to come back out and wipe out the 100 settlers. We don't know if that's true because what happens next is the English settlers, in kind of a fit of paranoia, they preemptively cross the water and they make it to the mainland and they attack the Native Americans that had previously been helping them and keeping them alive, and they actually wiped them out. These English settlers come back to Roanoke Island, and now the paranoia is even higher because now they don't have supplies, they don't know how to live there, they've just basically started a war, and it just so happens that an English-bound fleet was passing by the area on their way back to England, and when they stopped at the colony, the settlers were basically in a panic. I mean, at this point, they've just recently, wiped out this Native American tribe. They're freaking out about what's going to happen to them. And they were in such a rush to abandon the colony and evacuate that only 97 of them got on the ships and left. They literally left 3 people there. They said, well, they're not here for the evacuation, so we're out of here. And so sure enough, that fleet took the 97 settlers and they left, leaving those 3 settlers to fend for themselves. As irony would have it, just days after this evacuation, Sir Walter Raleigh, he had sent additional ships with resupplies and reinforcements to Roanoke, and they literally arrived like a couple days after this mass evacuation. But when they arrived, the colony was abandoned and they didn't find those 3 men that were left there. So Sir Walter Raleigh's reinforcements just left. And then a couple weeks later, another English-bound fleet passed by Roanoke and stopped to check in on the colony, and they found it abandoned. And because they had so many people on this fleet that was passing by, they decided to leave 15 crew members at the colony because they felt like this is an English colony. It's not in total disrepair at this point, and perhaps, this is going to be useful to the crown, or we can use it in some way. So they leave 15 crew members to basically guard the outpost while they go back to England and figure out what's going to happen next. So it would be months before anybody went back to Roanoke. So those 15 crew members were kind of hung out to dry a little bit. But a man by the name of John White, who had been a part of that initial failed colony in Roanoke, who had evacuated back to England, he was still eager to colonize America. And so he actually convinced Sir Walter Raleigh to launch a new expedition back to America to try to recolonize, not in Roanoke, but slightly north in the Chesapeake Bay, which was just viewed as a more fertile and just more advantageous position. And then in 1587, they send out 3 ships back to America to try this colonization effort all over again. It is important to note that unlike the first effort, which was much more kind of militaristic, it was literally 600 men that got sent to America. This time it was going to be a more kind of civilian approach, where it was men, women, and children being sent over to America to colonize. So with John White as the captain of these 3 ships, they're making their way towards America, and again, their plan was to go north to the Chesapeake Bay area. But they intended to pass by Roanoke on purpose because they knew about those 15 crew members that had been left there, almost a year prior. And so they intended to stop at Roanoke and basically have a meeting with those crew members, give them supplies if they needed it, and then make their way up to the Chesapeake Bay. However, something strange happens where the chief navigator, a man by the name of Simon Fernandez, who had navigated during the initial reconnaissance mission, the very first trip to America, also navigated for the second trip to America when they brought the 600 men, now navigating for this third trip with John White. He had the charisma of a real leader and was frankly just very well respected. He's an incredible sailor. And even though John White was technically the captain, really it was Fernandez that really had the respect of all of the people on this trip to America. And so for some reason, Fernandez decided that he just didn't want them to go up to Chesapeake Bay. And instead, when they got to Roanoke to have this meeting with the 15 crew members, he just basically told everybody to get off. Like, we're not gonna go north. Everybody that's here to colonize, go ahead and get off because we're out of here. And John White didn't put up a fight. I think he recognized that the pull this guy had was gonna be too much. And the crew and everybody who was there just kind of accepted it. And so even though it was a total deviation, they just begin to colonize Roanoke, even though, again, that was never their plan. So as they're literally descending upon Roanoke, they're getting ready to meet with these 15 crew members who they're really hoping are still alive, but there's no sign of them. There's no sign of the crew that were left behind, and all they find is like a little pile of bones. And John White speculated that, perhaps this is a sign that the crew members were, attacked by, the Native Americans that were seeking revenge because they had been wiped out from that initial group that had been here, the initial English settlers. John White's suspicions would actually be proven true when just a few days after the 100-plus group of colonists that kind of began setting up camp in Roanoke, a man by the name of George Howe was away from the colony a little bit, and a group of Native Americans surrounded him and shot him with 16 arrows. So it was kind of like a message to the settlers that, like, you're not welcome here. Your predecessors that wiped out an entire tribe, yeah, we haven't forgotten about that. So you're not allowed to be here. It was not a good start for John White and his new colony. Feeling like the colony was kind of doomed from the start, the colonists actually told John White, hey, if this is the way it's starting, we need more people here, we need more supplies, like this is not a good start. We are not set up for success here. You need to go back to England and get more supplies and bring them back here, because without that, we're doomed. And it just so happened that Fernandez, the guy that had kind of ditched them, he hadn't left the Outer Banks yet. He had anchored at the Outer Banks, and he was basically still available to take people back. And so John White initially was against the idea because he didn't want to be viewed as someone that was kind of abandoning the colony when he got back to England. And John White's daughter, who was pregnant, was there. She was one of the early colonists. She was there in Roanoke, and he didn't want to abandon her. But ultimately, he says, okay, I'll go. And he goes and gets on Fernandez's ship, and they go back to England. Now, unfortunately, when he got back to England, England was in the middle of a war with Spain. And so the Queen had ordered any English ship was basically not allowed to leave England because they needed to be able to defend themselves against the Spanish Armada. And so he wasn't able to leave England to go back to Roanoke, whether he had supplies or not, for 3 years. And so 3 years go by, and he finally, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, is able to be put on a convoy of ships that is going back to America with the necessary supplies. And so he heads off. So it's 1590, 3 years since John White has left Roanoke, left his daughter, and to go back for supplies. Now he's back, and he's got the supplies, and they get to the Outer Banks, and they get in their small boats to make their little journey up around to the north side of Roanoke so they can actually get on the island and go check out what's happening at Roanoke. And when they land on the north side of Roanoke, they start yelling to try to get anybody's attention. There's no answer. As they walk up into the woods, they notice that there are some fresh footprints right on the beach and then in the woods itself. But again, no one's coming to greet them, which is a bit of a bad omen, because if there are fresh tracks, either it's an English settler, in which case they would be eager to come see them, they'd be running out to meet them, or it's a Native American, which could mean they don't trust the English settlers, right? They don't want to show themselves, or they don't want to be seen, which is also kind of ominous. They start moving in to where the Roanoke colony was, and they see 3 letters on a tree. It just says CRO on a tree as they're making their way into the colony. And again, they're yelling the whole time, trying to get anybody's attention, and no one's calling out. There's no sign of life anywhere. So they see CRO on the tree, and then they keep moving closer, and now they break out the colony. And the colony, when they left, had not been heavily fortified. Now it was very heavily fortified with big pikes, basically like wooden pikes lining the outside of this basically looked like a fort. And on one of the wooden posts that was kind of fortifying the outside of Roanoke was the word Croatoan. There is not only nobody inside of this heavily fortified colony, this kind of fort, if you will, it looked like no one had been there in years. The grass was overgrown, basically anything of value had been looted effectively. The only things that were left were like really heavy objects that would have been difficult to move. But there was also no sign of a struggle. There was not like human remains anywhere. There wasn't a clear sign of struggle. I mean, obviously it's this well fortified area, which leads you to believe that they were at least anticipating some sort of attack, but there was no sign of a struggle. They're just gone. John White, he would write about this experience when he arrived and just discovered the colonies vanished, 115 people just gone, right? He wasn't actually concerned because the writing that he saw on the tree and on the wooden post to him meant something really specific. Before he left to go back to England to get the supplies, he had spoken with the people that would be staying there and said, look, if you need to abandon Roanoke for any reason, we need to have a system worked out to where if I come back and you're gone, I need to know what happened. And so you need to leave me a clue. You need to write a clue somewhere of where your destination is. If you're going by choice, just write the destination. If you're being forced, write the destination with a cross. And that will, to me, signify that you've left in distress. And so when he sees Croatoan and crow on the tree, to him, that just means, they must have relocated to the island of Croatoan, which was 50 miles to the south. He would detail in his notes that before he left Roanoke in 1587 to go get those supplies, he said that the settlers had been talking about leaving Roanoke, abandoning Roanoke, and moving 50 miles north to the mainland, not 50 miles south to an island. The concern was the island was isolated and not a good place to have a colony. And so they were talking about leaving it. And so he just kind of casually mentions in his notes, oh, well, they were thinking about leaving to go 50 miles to the mainland. So that might be why they're at Croatoan Island. But that doesn't really make any sense, because you're just kind of abandoning one problem set for another. Like, you want to leave an island because an island has unique problems. Why would you go to another island? You would go to the mainland. So that was kind of problematic. So John White believes they've just up and relocated to the Croatoan Island. And so he quickly takes his men and he goes back to the ship, and they begin to turn and set their course to go south the 50 miles to the Croatoan Island. But as fate would have it, the anchor line snapped as they're trying to make their way south to the Croatoan Island, and the weather was getting progressively worse and worse, and they start drifting north and north until finally the captain of the crew just said, look, we cannot go to the Croatoan Island. It's not going to be possible. And so they had to return to England. John White never would return to America. So he actually would end up dying with absolutely no idea what happened to the colony. And in fact, no one really knew what happened to the colony. It was just this huge cliffhanger. The assumption is they've gone to the Croatoan Island, but no one could prove that they really had. Literally, for centuries, people just speculated as to what could have happened to this colony. I mean, there's the assumption that perhaps they did just go to Croatoan and eventually kind of assimilated with the Native Americans there, and they just became a part of the culture there. There was other theories that they were wiped out at some point by angry Native Americans, but it was all just assumptions until the 1930s, when a small stone was found by a man just out walking around, and he turned it into a museum, and they looked at it, and it was written by Eleanor Dare, who was the daughter of John White, the pregnant daughter that he had abandoned and didn't get to see again. And she detailed what had happened. And half of the colony got wiped out by Native Americans that were angry at them, and then another percentage were taken captive, and then there's a couple survivors that are barely able to survive that don't really expect to live very long. At the time this stone was found, I mean, everybody knew that the last we had heard from the Roanoke colony was that they more than likely had made their way to the Croatoan Island, because that was the word written on the post, the CRO on the tree. I mean, that's what made the most sense. And so why would there be this stone by the daughter of John White 50 miles to the north of Roanoke? Wouldn't it make more sense to have been found on either Roanoke itself or at Croatoan? Like, it didn't really add up. And so a lot of people speculated that that stone had to have just been a fake, a hoax. But in 2011, a major discovery is made in the Roanoke case that actually lends a lot of credibility to the stone that Eleanor Dare had apparently written on. John White was a painter by trade, and he had created all these maps of the colony, of Virginia, of North Carolina, of everywhere he went. He basically painted a map. It was customary when you were making a map, if you had small mistakes on your map, you would actually cut a new piece of canvas, and you would put the corrections on that piece, and then you would slap it over wherever your mistakes were made. And so it wasn't uncommon, if you were looking at a map, to see little patches kind of all over the map. And so for literally centuries, there were these maps that John White had created that had a number of these little patches on the map. And in 2011, somebody who was researching said, well, why don't we look under the patches and just confirm that they really were just that, little mistakes that were covered up and corrected with a patch. And it turned out that on one of the maps, there was a patch over a section of land 50 miles to the north of Roanoke, around the area where that stone had been found. And underneath the patch was a star. And the star was set to resemble a fort. So basically there is an English fort built, basically where that stone had been found. But it had been covered over with a patch, as if the fort was a mistake, right? Like, oh, whoops, shouldn't have been a fort there. And they put a patch over it. But upon closer inspection, the patch that had been put over that X on the map that signified a fort right where that stone had been found, well, on the patch, there was literally hidden ink where someone had drawn a similar X to denote a fort, and they'd put that over the obvious fort symbol that they were covering up. One could maybe make the case that They wanted to signify to someone that was maybe looking for invisible ink, they wanted to signify that that was where the fort was, but they didn't want someone who intercepted the map, for example, the Spanish, because they'd just been at war with the Spanish. They did not want them to know where a location of a fort was. Researchers began calling that site where there was that patch, Site X. Now, Site X is 50 miles to the north of Roanoke. And if you recall from what John White had put in his description when he was describing finding the writing on the tree and the post when he returned to Roanoke in 1590, he had referenced that the colony was planning to move 50 miles north to the mainland because that was a more suitable place to live. But of course, with the writing on the trees, everyone thought, oh, well, they end up going to Croatoan. Well, now as Site X, that is a location that lines up with what they had originally said they were going to do. And you have that stone written by Eleanor Dare at the same location. And so archaeologists descended upon the area that was Site X, and while they haven't confirmed that there's a fort or they haven't found a fort in the area, they have found metal and pottery that is potentially indicative of an English settlement. And in fact, right now, they're still doing all sorts of archaeological digs and research to try to determine if that is where the Roanoke colony went. But even if that is the answer to the mystery, that in fact, it was just this hidden map and this stone that said, yep, they went 50 miles north, it doesn't really answer the question, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of the Roanoke colony, of why was Croatoan written on the fence post? Why was Crow written on the tree? Why were they there? And how is it that with all these eyes and all this interest in this case, dating back to literally the 1500s, how has no one ever found even one of the remains of the 115 colonists that apparently just vanished into thin air? So it's a fascinating case with recent developments, which makes it even more fascinating. And I would love to hear if you have any theories about what could have happened to the colonists, to leave it in the comments so we can discuss it. So that's going to do it. If you want to be in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I post quite a bit on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, I'll talk to you guys soon.
On the morning of March 22nd, 1977, a 44-year-old woman named Ruth Morgan rushed around her kitchen in the American city of Tucson, Arizona, like she did almost every day. Ruth was making sure her 4 daughters had everything they needed for school. As she did this, her girls all sat at the kitchen table eating their cereal, and their father, Ruth's husband, 39-year-old Chuck Morgan, sipped his coffee nearby. Ruth wished that Chuck would notice that she could really use some help right now getting the girls' stuff ready, but like he had been more and more recently, Chuck just seemed to be off in his own world. Annoyed, Ruth opened the fridge, took out 2 lunches packed in paper bags, and handed them to her younger daughters, and then she grabbed 2 backpacks that were lying on the floor nearby, and she handed them to her older girls. Then, a few minutes later, all 4 girls were hurrying out the door toward the car, with Ruth and Chuck following after them. As Chuck climbed into the driver's seat of their Mercury Cougar, Ruth, who was standing outside the car and would not be joining them, asked Chuck what time he'd be home from work. Chuck was going to drop the kids off and then go to his office. And for a second, Chuck didn't answer his wife. He just sat there looking totally exhausted. Chuck ran his own escrow company, which meant that his firm set up real estate deals between buyers and sellers to make sure the deals were conducted legally. And Tucson's real estate market was booming, so Chuck had been working a lot recently. Through the open car window, he turned and told Ruth that he was working on a huge deal, so he didn't really know what time he'd be back. Ruth wished Chuck did not have to work so much, but she also knew that nothing she said could stop him. As long as she'd known him, Chuck had been incredibly driven, to the point where sometimes Ruth worried about his health. He never took time off, and on the rare instances where he was not working, he didn't do things to relax, like watching TV or going and seeing his friends. Instead, it just seemed like Chuck bounced from one business deal or crisis to the next. And about once a year, he would push himself so hard with his work that he would basically have a nervous breakdown. At least that's what Ruth called it. And at that point, he would take a week off to recover, but that was it. The rest of the time, he basically worked 24/7. But Ruth also knew that Chuck's insane work ethic and drive was definitely paying off. It had already made their family much more financially successful than they ever imagined possible. Chuck and Ruth had grown up in very modest households, and so now to be able to give their girls a comfortable upbringing was quite satisfying for the parents. And so, on this typical Tuesday morning, Ruth did not push back on the possibility of Chuck needing to work late to finish this big deal. Instead, she just told him he looked great in his brown suit, she gave him a kiss, and watched as he turned on the car, pulled out of the driveway, and headed off in the direction of the girls' school. That afternoon, the girls came home from school on their own power, and Ruth sent them outside to play while she got dinner ready. She set a place at the table for the whole family, including Chuck, but when 6 o'clock rolled around and Chuck was still not home, Ruth and the girls decided to just eat without him. And when Ruth got the girls bathed and into their pajamas and tucked them into their beds, Chuck was still not home. But Ruth was not worried. This really was kind of typical for Chuck. Chuck's real estate clients were mostly rich businessmen who were buying up land all across the state, and they wanted a lot for their money. They were always calling Chuck away for meetings out of town without any warning, and sometimes Chuck would be gone at these meetings for a couple of days at a time without any notice. And at the time, in 1977, there were no cell phones, and most people, including Ruth and her family, didn't have answering machines. And so, when Ruth hadn't seen Chuck or heard from him, she just figured he must have tried calling the house earlier to let her know that he would indeed be out super late on this deal, but she just must have missed the call because she was out running errands, and so Chuck would just get back whenever he got back. So that night, Ruth went to bed alone, figuring that she would wake up and see Chuck in the morning, or at a minimum, she would get a call the next day from Chuck to figure out where he was, what he was doing, and when to expect him home. But the next day, Chuck did not come home, and he didn't call. And it was the same story the next day. But again, Ruth had seen this behavior from Chuck before. It was rare, but Chuck did sometimes just kind of vanish for days at a stretch on certain deals. And so, at 2 a.m. on March 25th, 3 days after Ruth last saw Chuck or heard from Chuck, it was when he drove off to drop the girls at school, Ruth lay awake in her and Chuck's upstairs bedroom, trying to now convince herself that Chuck was fine, that everything was okay, that this was totally normal. But she now knew that this was officially the longest stretch of time she had ever gone without hearing from Chuck. And deep down, she started to feel like something had to be wrong. But as she lay there stressing out about all sorts of what-if scenarios, she heard the family dog barking downstairs, and instantly, Ruth let out a sigh of relief. The dog must be barking because Chuck was walking in the door. He was home. So Ruth climbed out of bed, she walked into the hallway, flipped on the light, and began heading downstairs. And as she descended the steps, she called out to Chuck, but no one answered. When she got to the first floor, there was still no answer, and the dog was now starting to bark even louder. And suddenly the hairs on Ruth's arms stood up. If Chuck wasn't home, why was the dog barking? What was going on? She dashed across the living room into the kitchen, she turned on the light, and saw the family dog up on its hind legs, pawing at the back door and barking. Ruth very slowly crept toward that door and pulled back the curtain that covered a small window on it, and she looked outside. And what she saw took her breath away. It was Chuck. However, he was just standing there on the back step, not making any attempt to come in the house. And he had this crazed look on his face. And when he saw Ruth, he didn't react. He just stood there staring. Ruth had no idea what her husband was doing. She was just relieved that he was home. And so she reached down and fumbled with the lock. She opened the door and frantically told Chuck to come in and tell her what was going on. Where had he been? But once the door was open, Chuck kind of just staggered into the kitchen and literally fell into Ruth's arms. She dragged him across the room and put him in one of the kitchen chairs, and then once he was seated, Ruth finally got a good look at her husband and she nearly screamed. Chuck's eyes were totally bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days, and his wrists were bound with zip ties, and he had a plastic handcuff on one of his ankles. But what scared Ruth most of all was that Chuck still was just not speaking. She asked him again to tell her what was going on, but he just sat there silent, looking off into the distance. Ruth ran to a kitchen drawer and grabbed a knife, and then she rushed to Chuck and cut the ties around his wrists, and when Chuck's hands were free, he finally began to communicate with Ruth. but not with words, instead with hand gestures. He motioned towards a notepad and pen sitting on the counter nearby, and so Ruth, understanding what he was asking for, reached over and grabbed the pen and paper and handed them to Chuck. And as he wrote, Ruth, who was now kind of hovering over his shoulder, couldn't believe the words on the paper. When Chuck was done, Ruth ran to the phone and said they had to call 911 right now. But at this, Chuck banged on the table and shook his head at her to stop. Then, in huge letters on the pad, he told Ruth that if they called the cops, their whole family would be killed. Ruth moved away from the phone and started crying. Chuck began to stand up, and Ruth instinctively grabbed him and supported him on her shoulder, and then just walked him upstairs to their bedroom, where he lay down and fell asleep almost instantly. And after he was asleep, Ruth, not knowing what else to do, just did a quick check of the girls and was very relieved to see that none of them had woken up to the commotion of their father returning. Then Ruth headed back to her own bedroom and laid down next to Chuck, but she didn't shut her eyes. Instead, she lay awake trying to figure out what the heck just happened and what she was going to do about it. On the notepad, Chuck had written that he'd been kidnapped and tortured for 2 days before managing to escape, and that now his throat was coated with a hallucinogenic drug that made it impossible for him to talk and could maybe even kill him if he ingested it. It should be noted here that we don't really know if he meant the drug was painted inside of his throat or if it was painted on the outside of his neck. We just don't know. The whole thing just seemed totally insane, and so Ruth, as she lay there, started to wonder if maybe this was one of Chuck's annual nervous breakdowns from overworking. But if it was, then this was the most bizarre and extreme breakdown she had ever seen. It took almost a week for Chuck to recover from whatever had happened to him, and during that time, he only communicated with Ruth via notes on a notepad. Again, he was convinced there was a drug painted either on or in his throat that he had to avoid ingesting, and so not talking was his solution. At the beginning of this recovery week, Ruth asked Chuck lots of questions about where he had been and what had happened, but again, she got virtually no answers from him. And so pretty early on in that week, Ruth just began focusing on nursing her husband back to health, which included giving him water through an eyedropper because he had written that if he drank too much liquid at one time, this hallucinogenic drug coating his throat might activate and attack his nervous system. Finally, after that week of recovery was up and Chuck got out of bed and started talking again, Ruth now demanded answers about this whole crazy situation. But nothing Chuck said to her made any sense. Chuck told Ruth that owning his escrow business was not his only job. In addition to his escrow business, he was actually an undercover agent for the U.S. Treasury Department. The Treasury Department is a federal agency that investigates financial crimes. Chuck didn't say who had kidnapped him, but he said they knew he had information that could send them to prison for a long time. As Ruth listened to what her husband was saying, she simply didn't believe him. Instead, she thought this really had to be one of his big annual nervous breakdowns, and that eventually he would just snap out of this and be normal Chuck again. And so, when Chuck insisted that Ruth not tell anyone what he had told her about his real identity and the trouble he had now gotten into, Ruth didn't really care and said, "Fine, I won't tell anyone." But over the next couple of months, Chuck did not snap out of it. He did not become normal Chuck. Instead, his mental state seemed to get worse and worse. He started wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a .357 Magnum revolver, which is a very powerful pistol, whenever he left the house. He also bought a special belt that could conceal a knife in the buckle, and he grew a big thick beard to disguise his face. He was also convinced that someone had bugged their home phone, so he started to leave the house and go to payphones whenever he had to make calls. And whenever Ruth, who was now becoming very seriously concerned for her husband, asked him what was going on or what he was so scared of, he would just tell her the less she knew, the safer she'd be. On the morning of June 7th, so about 2.5 months after Chuck had stumbled in their back door insisting he had been kidnapped and drugged, Ruth wound up driving the girls to school that morning. When she left, Chuck told her he would be going to his office that day. After Ruth left, Chuck headed to a payphone near their house and called his staff, informing them that he would be there in about a half an hour. But he never showed up, and eventually someone from his staff called the police. Even though Ruth had done what her husband had asked and had not gone to police or told anyone about his strange behavior, she couldn't help but feel incredibly relieved when she heard that the Tucson police had put out a missing person alert for Chuck. However, when the police spoke to her, she opted to continue keeping Chuck's secret, mostly because she was worried if she told them what he told her, they would think he was crazy or dangerous. And so all she told police was that she was just very worried about him and hoped he would come home soon. 9 days later, on the night of June 16th, Chuck had still not been found, he was still missing, no one knew where he was, and this night, Ruth was home, she was sitting on the couch, staring at the television, but she wasn't really watching it. Her mind was wondering where the heck her husband was, and she couldn't help but think that something terrible had happened to him. And as she sat there staring blankly at the TV, the phone rang in the kitchen. And suddenly, Ruth felt a jolt of energy, thinking maybe it was Chuck. And so she ran to the kitchen, she answered the phone, but instead of hearing her husband's voice, she heard a woman's voice that she didn't recognize, and in a quiet voice, the strange woman said, "Ruthie, Chuck is all right. Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Then the woman hung up. Ruth just stood there for a second, holding the phone to her ear, listening to the dial tone. Now she was even more confused. Was this some sign that Chuck really was an undercover agent for the Treasury Department, and this woman maybe worked with him there, and maybe she was like his handler, and maybe she was now reaching out to Ruth with some code? I mean, Ruth had no idea, but at least now, Ruth had a clue about what happened to her husband. She had this Bible passage, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. So Ruth hung up the phone and ran to a bookshelf in the living room. She stretched up to reach the top shelf and she grabbed her family Bible, and then Ruth rushed with the Bible to the couch. She sat down and flipped through the pages until she got to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verses 1-8. Ruth read the verses, but she didn't understand what they could possibly have to do with Chuck. They read in part, quote, "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken." End quote. Ruth eventually just slammed the Bible closed because she had no idea what it meant, and frankly, she had no idea what to think about anything anymore. And at this point, all she hoped for was that her husband was somehow still alive somewhere in the world, and that hopefully he would return soon. About 24 hours later, on June 17th, Chuck, who was actually only a few miles away from his home, sped through Tucson in his Mercury Cougar, constantly checking his rearview mirror to make sure no one was following him. Then he suddenly turned into the parking lot of a cheap motel where he had been hiding out for the last few days, and he came to a stop. Chuck was wearing his bulletproof vest over a sweat-stained dress shirt, and he was also now missing a tooth. Chuck grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat, and he unholstered his .357 Magnum. Then he climbed out of his car, slammed the door, and sprinted with the briefcase and gun in hand toward the motel. Once safely inside his room, Chuck locked the door and placed the gun as well as the briefcase down on the bed. And then he opened the briefcase, and what he saw made him smile. He was looking at $60,000 in cash stacked neatly inside. For reference, $60,000 then would be worth about $300,000 in today's dollars. Chuck had put this money in the briefcase himself, but he was paranoid that somehow it would just disappear, and so looking at it calmed him down. Then Chuck closed the briefcase and pulled a black marker along with a $2 bill out of his pocket. $2 bills are the rarest form of cash produced in the United States. Then he placed that $2 bill on the bedside table and started writing on it with the marker. After he was done, he pulled his pants down and pinned the now marked up $2 bill to his underwear. Then he pulled his pants back up, he grabbed his gun, he grabbed the briefcase, and then he turned around and rushed right back outside to his car. Once he got there, he threw the briefcase into the passenger seat and then jumped into the driver's seat where he turned the ignition and peeled out of the parking lot. He sped west for a while and eventually pulled onto a dark desert road. After getting about 30 miles outside of Tucson, he swerved off the road into a secluded desert clearing where he stopped the car and cut the ignition. At this point, Chuck reached into his pocket and took out a wadded-up tissue, and he unwrapped it. Inside was the tooth he was missing. He stared at it for a second before balling it back up and then placing it in the backseat of his car. Then he checked to make sure his gun was still in his holster, and it was, and then after taking a deep breath, he grabbed the briefcase from the passenger seat and stepped outside of his car into the desert. The next day, June 18th, Ruth was in her living room when there was a knock at the front door. When Ruth opened it, an officer from the Pima County Sheriff's Department was standing there. For a second, Ruth felt a flood of relief. Maybe they were here to say they found Chuck and that he was okay. But moments later, when she was sitting on her couch in the living room, the officer told her that he had some bad news. 2 people driving down a highway in the desert to the west of the city had just discovered Chuck's body. The officer told Ruth that Chuck was lying out in the sand and appeared to have committed suicide. The officer suggested that perhaps Chuck had had some sort of mental breakdown, as his appearance was totally bizarre. He was missing a tooth that looked like it had recently been knocked out or pulled out. He was armed with this powerful firearm, and in his pocket was a $2 bill with incomprehensible messages written all over it. Ruth was absolutely devastated, even though she wasn't really shocked at the news. After a moment, when she had composed herself, she asked the officer if any of the messages on the $2 bill might be like a suicide note for her and the kids, explaining what had happened. And the officer just shook his head and said no, there was no communication left behind besides on this $2 bill, and that was definitely not intended for you. After hearing this, Ruth finally just broke down and sobbed. She felt a horrible sense of guilt and regret about how she had handled Chuck's behavior over the last few months. She wished she had just totally ignored his request and gone to the police right away, or at least told someone about what was going on with him, because maybe then he'd be alive. But underneath her own feelings of guilt, Ruth also started to feel kind of angry with Chuck. Why hadn't he left behind some sort of note for her or the kids? Why would he take his life without at least explaining the situation to his own family who he loved? It made no sense. In the aftermath of Chuck's death, Ruth planned his funeral and focused all of her energy on making sure her girls were okay. She didn't want to believe that Chuck had killed himself, but the police department was adamant that that was what happened. And in time, Ruth and her kids began to accept that that was the reality. Fast forward to sometime in the late 1980s, roughly a decade after Chuck had died, and Ruth was home in the same house she had shared with Chuck when her phone rang. And when she heard what the man on the other end of the line had to say, her heart suddenly started to beat rapidly, and she had to grab a chair to sit down. The caller's name was Don Devereaux, and he was an investigative reporter. And he told Ruth that he wanted to meet with her because he had something very important to tell her. Something he said she might not believe. It was about her late husband, Chuck. When the pair met at a local coffee shop, Don asked Ruth if she was really ready to hear everything, even if it was painful. And Ruth, even though her voice trembled, didn't hesitate. She said, "Yes, tell me." Based on Don's independent investigation following Chuck's death, this is a reconstruction of what Don believes could have happened on the night of June 17, 1977, the night that police said Chuck committed suicide. According to Dawn's theory, on the night of June 17th, Chuck drove out into the desert, he parked, he stepped out of his car carrying that briefcase that contained $60,000 in cash, he had his .357 Magnum pistol on his hip, and more guns in the car, and as he's standing out there, he sees up ahead headlights suddenly appear a few yards away from where Chuck was standing, and once that car came to a stop, a man stepped out who was wearing a dark suit. Chuck took a step towards this man, but the man quickly pulled out a gun and aimed it at Chuck, and so Chuck froze. The man told him to show him the cash, at which point Chuck did open up the briefcase. The man told Chuck to put the briefcase on the ground and turn around, and so Chuck followed the instructions, believing that in just a few minutes, the nightmare he had been living through would finally be over, and he would be able to drive back home to Ruth and his girls, and then they could move far away and put all of this behind them forever. After turning away from the man in the suit, Chuck stood there listening to the sound of this man walking closer and closer to him. And then this man's footsteps stopped right behind him, and suddenly Chuck would have felt a jerk by his hip, and he would have realized the man in the suit had grabbed Chuck's gun from its holster. And then before Chuck could do anything, this man had fired Chuck's gun into the back of Chuck's head, killing him instantly. Then the man in the suit wiped the gun of his fingerprints and positioned it near Chuck's hand to make it look like Chuck had shot himself. Then the man in the suit grabbed the briefcase, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving Chuck's body where he fell. Dawn wasn't sure if Chuck actually worked undercover for the U.S. Treasury Department, but Dawn did think that Chuck had somehow gotten involved with organized crime, most likely through his escrow business. Dawn believed that Chuck had been conducting illegal real estate deals that allowed criminals to smuggle drugs into Arizona from Mexico, and then Chuck was then laundering their drug money for them. Money laundering is concealing money gained illegally by transferring it through international banks into legitimate businesses like real estate. Dawn knew that weeks before Chuck's supposed kidnapping, the state of Arizona and the Arizona Attorney General's office had named Chuck as a witness in a trial that involved an organized crime boss. Dawn believed that that crime boss had hired a hitman to kill Chuck to keep him from testifying against him. And most likely, according to Dawn, Chuck had figured this out. And so that was why Chuck had begun carrying a weapon around and wearing a bulletproof vest all the time. But Dawn said he had learned from a friend of Chuck's, a woman known simply as, quote, Green Eyes, that the hitman had told Chuck he would call off the hit if Chuck just paid him, the hitman, $60,000 in cash. So Dawn believes that Chuck jumped at this opportunity to save himself, and it was likely the reason he left his house on June 7th, 1977, to go get the money and pay off the hitman. However, the meeting with the hitman didn't happen until June 17th, 10 days later. And obviously the hitman did not keep his promise. The hitman was very likely the man in the suit, and he just took the money from Chuck and killed him anyways. And so as for what Chuck was doing and why he was avoiding his wife and kids and the police during those 10 days between when he left his house on June 7th and disappeared and when he was killed on June 17th, Dawn, and everybody else for that matter, has no idea. And that was far from the only unanswered question in this case. The friend of Chuck's, known as Green Eyes, admitted to being the woman who called Ruth on June 16th, the night before Chuck died, to mention that Bible verse from Ecclesiastes. However, she never specified what it meant. Dawn believed that the Bible verse could be a code that Chuck had asked Green Eyes to pass along to Ruth and his family, maybe to signify that he was okay. But if the Bible verse was really a code, why hadn't Chuck given Ruth a way to crack it? Because she had no idea what it meant. Again, Dawn doesn't know, and really no one knows why. As for the tooth that was found in the back seat of Chuck's car out in the desert, Dawn said that had a very specific meaning. At the time Chuck died, there were rumors that some mobsters removed their victims' teeth to keep them from being identified by police after they were killed. So Dawn believed that maybe Chuck removed one of his teeth in advance of his meeting with this hitman and then left the tooth in his car to ensure officials would be able to still identify him if the worst were to happen during this meeting. As for the $2 bill that was found with the strange messages written all over it, Dawn said these messages were not nonsense at all. They were Chuck's attempt to tell the world what had happened to him. Don had not completely solved the riddle, but he believed he was close. On the front of the $2 bill, Chuck had written 7 Spanish last names. On the back, where the $2 bill shows a picture of the founding fathers who had signed the Declaration of Independence, Chuck had labeled each of the men in the picture with the numbers 1 through 7. He had also scrawled a crude map of a route from Tucson to the Mexican border. Don told Ruth that he believed the names and the map were Chuck's way of pointing to specific smugglers moving drugs between Mexico and Tucson. There was one last clue on the $2 bill. It was the phrase Ecclesiastes 12. This was the same section of the Bible that Green Eyes had mentioned to Ruth on the phone on June 16th. And so it supported the theory that the Bible verse could be some kind of code, but of course that code is still not cracked. After Don finished telling Ruth his theory about Chuck, Ruth felt a sense of relief that maybe finally she had gotten the explanation she had so desperately wanted for all these years. But at the same time, it was clear that Don's theory was just that, a theory. And there are many more compelling theories about Chuck, some that include him actually being an undercover agent for the government, others that paint him as a man who simply lost his mind. But as of today, all we know for sure is that Chuck was found shot to death out in the desert, and officially, his death is still listed as a suicide.